Do this from day one of the holiday, or you waited till the end?
I'd been planning it for a while, but as every guy out there will know, it takes a certain amount of motivation to get yourself going. So,
at first, it looked like nothing more than another routine update from the royal family. There was no dramatic warning, no urgent bulletin, and no indication that anything extraordinary was about to happen. Yet within minutes, royal watchers across Britain, the United States, Canada, and beyond were asking the same question. Why had the palace chosen this particular moment to make an announcement about Catherine, Princess of Wales? And as details slowly began to emerge, it became clear that this was about far more than a simple royal statement. 4 months, attention surrounding Catherine, Princess of Wales, had been unlike anything seen in recent royal history. Every appearance, every photograph, and every public engagement seemed to generate intense discussion. Supporters praised her composure and dedication, while commentators increasingly pointed to something else taking shape beneath the surface. The future of the monarchy was no longer being discussed solely through the lens of tradition. More and more, those conversations were beginning to revolve around Catherine herself. That was what made the palace announcement so intriguing. The statement was not delivered with the grandeur often associated with historic royal moments. There were no state ceremonies, no elaborate processions, and no carefully choreographed balcony appearances. Instead, the announcement arrived quietly, almost unexpectedly, creating a wave of curiosity precisely because of its simplicity. Sometimes the most significant developments inside the monarchy do not arrive with fanfare. Sometimes they arrive with a few carefully chosen words. As news organizations rushed to interpret the meaning behind the announcement, another question quickly emerged. Why now? After all, the royal family has spent years navigating an unusually complex period. The reign of King Charles III represents a major transition for the institution, while public attention frequently shifts toward Prince William and Catherine as the future faces of the monarchy. At the same time, discussions involving Prince Harry and Meghan Markle continue to influence perceptions of the royal family around the world. Against that backdrop, any major announcement involving Catherine was always going to attract enormous attention. Yet what surprised many observers was not simply the announcement itself. It was the reaction that followed. Almost immediately, social media platforms filled with messages from supporters expressing admiration for the Princess of Wales. Royal commentators noted that public interest appeared unusually intense, even by royal standards. Some analysts suggested that the response reflected years of goodwill built through her charitable work and public service. Others argued that it revealed something deeper, a growing belief among many members of the public that Catherine represents an important bridge between the monarchy's traditions and its future. That interpretation raised another fascinating question. Has Catherine's role within the institution quietly evolved beyond what many people initially expected? When she first joined the royal family, much of the discussion focused on how she would adapt to royal life. The attention centered on learning protocols, undertaking engagements, and supporting the future king. Over time, however, the conversation changed. Rather than simply adapting to the institution, Catherine increasingly appeared to be helping shape its modern identity. Her work on early childhood development, mental health initiatives, and family-focused causes gradually created a distinct public profile. Unlike the dramatic headlines that often dominate royal coverage, these efforts unfolded steadily over many years. Yet their cumulative impact became difficult to ignore. That steady approach may explain why the latest announcement resonated so strongly. Observers noted that the public response was not driven by shock alone. It reflected trust. In an era when public institutions often struggle to maintain confidence, Catherine has consistently ranked among the most respected members of the royal family. That reputation was built carefully, engagement by engagement, year after year. But if the announcement highlighted Catherine's growing influence, it also revealed something about the monarchy itself. For generations, royal authority was often associated with distance and formality. Today's public expectations are very different. People increasingly value authenticity, empathy, and personal connection. The challenge facing modern royals is not simply preserving tradition. It is finding ways to make those traditions meaningful to contemporary audiences. Many royal watchers believe Catherine has become central to that effort. What makes this particularly interesting is that her influence rarely comes through dramatic statements or headline-grabbing controversies. Instead, it emerges through consistency. While other royal stories often dominate news cycles for days before fading away, Catherine's public standing appears to have strengthened through a much quieter process. And that is where the palace announcement becomes even more significant. Because behind the official language lies a larger story about succession, public trust, and the future direction of the monarchy. The announcement may have focused on Catherine, but it inevitably sparked discussion about Prince William as well. Together, the Prince and Princess of Wales increasingly represent the next chapter of royal leadership. Every development involving one of them is therefore viewed through a broader institutional lens. Some commentators have even suggested that recent events reveal an accelerating transition of public attention from the present reign toward the future one. Whether that assessment is accurate remains open to debate. Yet the fact that such discussions are occurring at all speaks volumes about Catherine's growing importance. Still, one crucial question remained unanswered. What exactly prompted the royal family to make this announcement now, and what conversations were taking place behind palace walls before the public ever heard about it? Because as journalists and royal insiders continued examining the details, they began uncovering a series of developments that suggested the story was much larger than it first appeared. And what they discovered next would transform a seemingly straightforward announcement into one of the most closely watched royal developments of the year. What made the announcement so remarkable was not what the palace said publicly. It was what happened afterward. Within hours, royal commentators began focusing on a detail that initially received very little attention. The statement itself had highlighted Catherine's expanding responsibilities and influence, yet there was a noticeable absence of something many expected to see. There was no extensive effort to position the announcement within the broader framework of the king's reign. For some observers, that omission seemed insignificant. For others, it raised a far more consequential question. Was the announcement simply recognizing Catherine's growing role, or was it quietly signaling how the monarchy intends to navigate its future? That distinction matters because royal institutions rarely communicate through words alone. Timing, symbolism, and emphasis often carry their own meaning. Several royal analysts noted that the announcement arrived during a period when public interest in the Prince and Princess of Wales appears stronger than ever. If the palace merely wanted to acknowledge Catherine's work, there were numerous opportunities to do so. Instead, this announcement arrived at a moment when discussions about the future direction of the monarchy were already intensifying. And that is where the story began to expand. The more commentators examined public reaction, the more they noticed a pattern. People were not simply celebrating Catherine. They were increasingly discussing what her rise revealed about changing expectations of royal leadership itself. For generations, authority within the monarchy flowed from position, hierarchy, and tradition. Today, however, influence often operates differently. Public trust can become just as important as constitutional status. Popularity does not replace authority, but it can shape how authority is perceived. That reality places Catherine in a uniquely significant position. Unlike many royal figures throughout modern history, she has managed to build broad support across multiple demographics simultaneously. Younger audiences see her as modern and relatable. Older audiences often view her as a stabilizing figure who respects tradition. International observers frequently describe her as one of the institution's most effective public ambassadors. The announcement, therefore, appeared to acknowledge something the public had already begun to recognize. Yet that recognition created another layer of uncertainty. Because every increase in influence inevitably alters relationships within an institution. Not necessarily through conflict, but through shifting expectations. As Catherine's public role expands, so does the attention directed toward Kensington Palace. And whenever attention shifts, questions about priorities and future planning naturally follow. Some royal watchers pointed to a fascinating historical pattern. Throughout modern royal history, certain figures have transcended the roles originally envisioned for them. Their significance eventually became larger than their official position. In those moments, institutions often face a challenge. Do they adapt to that reality, or attempt to manage it carefully behind the scenes? The current situation appears especially intriguing because the monarchy is already navigating a period of transition. King Charles III spent decades preparing for his reign, yet the institution he inherited is vastly different from the one that existed even 20 years ago. Public expectations have changed. Media coverage has changed. The speed at which public opinion forms has changed. Every major royal development now unfolds under an unprecedented level of scrutiny. Against that backdrop, Catherine's growing prominence takes on greater significance. Some commentators believe the announcement reflects strategic planning. According to this interpretation, the palace understands that continuity matters. The monarchy's long-term stability depends not only on the current reign, but also on preparing the public for the next generation of leadership. Others offer a different interpretation. They argue that the announcement may be less about planning and more about responding to reality. Public interest in the Princess of Wales has reached a point where formal recognition became almost unavoidable. Rather than shaping public perception, the palace may simply be acknowledging a shift that has already occurred. Both explanations sound plausible. And that uncertainty is precisely what keeps the story moving forward. Because if the announcement was strategic, it suggests careful preparation for the future. If it was reactive, it suggests public sentiment is exerting greater influence on the institution than many previously assumed. Neither possibility is insignificant. Meanwhile, another development began attracting attention. Several royal commentators noted that conversations following the announcement increasingly focused on partnership rather than individual achievement. Catherine's growing influence cannot be separated from the role of the Prince of Wales. Their public image has become deeply interconnected, creating a dynamic that differs from many previous royal generations. This matters because monarchies do not function solely through individual personalities. They function through teams, households, and long-term institutional relationships. When public confidence concentrates around a partnership rather than a single figure, it can reshape expectations about how future leadership will operate. The implication is larger than it first appears. Many people initially viewed the announcement as a story about Catherine. Increasingly, however, analysts began framing it as a story about the future leadership model of the monarchy itself. Would future royal leadership place greater emphasis on visibility and direct engagement? Would traditional ceremonial authority gradually share space with a more personal style of public service? Could this announcement represent an early indication of that transformation? No definitive answers emerged, but the questions continued multiplying. At the same time, reports suggested palace advisors were carefully monitoring public reaction. That is hardly unusual. Royal households routinely track media coverage and public sentiment. What made this moment different was the intensity of the response. Support extended well beyond Britain, generating discussions across international audiences that often follow royal developments closely. For an institution whose relevance increasingly depends upon global visibility, that level of engagement carries weight. And yet perhaps the most intriguing aspect of all was what remained unknown. The announcement revealed the outcome. It did not reveal the process. What conversations took place before the decision was finalized? Who supported the move most strongly? Were there differing views regarding how prominently Catherine's role should be presented? Royal institutions rarely disclose such discussions, which means much of a decision-making remains hidden from public view. That absence of information created a new curiosity gap, one that commentators quickly began exploring. Because if the public announcement was significant, the internal conversations that preceded it may have been even more revealing. Some royal analysts suggested the decision could reflect broader efforts to modernize aspects of the monarchy's public-facing structure. Others cautioned against reading too much into a single announcement. Both perspectives gained traction. Both left important questions unanswered. What everyone seemed to agree on, however, was this. The story was no longer just about a palace statement. It was becoming a story about influence, succession, institutional adaptation, and the evolving relationship between the royal family and the public it serves. And just as observers thought they were beginning to understand the significance of the announcement, attention started turning toward a series of developments behind the scenes that could reveal whether this moment was symbolic or the beginning of something much more consequential. What began to emerge from all of this was a realization that the announcement itself may never have been the real story. The statement brought Catherine into the spotlight, but the deeper significance seemed to lie in what that spotlight revealed. The more closely royal observers examined the reaction, the more they noticed that public attention was behaving differently than it had during previous royal announcements. People were not merely responding to news. They were responding to what the news appeared to represent. And that distinction may explain why the story continued to grow long after the announcement was made. For years, discussions about the future of the monarchy have largely centered on succession. Who would inherit responsibility? How would the institution adapt? What kind of leadership would define the next era? Yet the recent reactions suggested something more nuanced. Increasingly, public conversations were not focusing solely on who would lead, but on how leadership itself should look. That shift helps explain why Catherine's role has attracted such attention. Royal commentators have noted that modern monarchies face a challenge unlike anything encountered by previous generations. Tradition remains essential because it provides continuity and legitimacy. At the same time, public expectations increasingly favor accessibility, empathy, and visible engagement. Balancing those competing demands is not easy. Too much change risks weakening tradition. Too little change risks creating distance. Some observers believe Catherine has become important precisely because she appears to navigate that balance unusually well. If that assessment is correct, it may explain why the announcement resonated far beyond its official purpose. But another piece of the puzzle soon became visible. The growing prominence of the Princess of Wales did not occur in isolation. It coincided with a broader pattern that several royal analysts have been tracking for years. Increasingly, major public initiatives, charitable campaigns, and long-term projects associated with the future of the monarchy appear connected to Kensington Palace rather than elsewhere within the royal structure. On its own, that observation might seem insignificant, yet when viewed alongside the announcement, it creates a larger question. Is the institution gradually preparing the public for a future transition without formally discussing that transition? Royal households rarely operate according to election cycles or short-term political timelines. Their planning often stretches across decades rather than years. As a result, preparations for future leadership can begin long before the public recognizes them. That possibility may help explain why some commentators viewed the announcement as part of a much larger pattern rather than a standalone event. Interestingly, the timing of the announcement also attracted attention for another reason. Periods of uncertainty often strengthen public attachment to figures perceived as stable and reassuring. Throughout modern royal history, moments of institutional challenge have frequently elevated individuals capable of embodying continuity while also representing renewal. Several royal watchers pointed out that Catherine increasingly occupies precisely that position, not because she seeks it, but because public perception has gradually placed her there. That observation leads to an even more intriguing question. How much of this development is being driven by palace strategy, and how much is being driven by public sentiment itself? The answer remains unclear. Some analysts argue that the institution understands the importance of strengthening trusted figures during periods of transition. Others believe public enthusiasm has moved faster than any internal planning process could anticipate. What makes the situation fascinating is that both explanations could be true simultaneously. And if they are, the implications become much larger. Because institutions can influence perception, but they cannot entirely control it. History offers several examples of royal figures whose public influence eventually exceeded the expectations of palace planners. In each case, the challenge was not whether those individuals were popular. The challenge was determining how that popularity would interact with the institution itself. That historical pattern matters today because it highlights a recurring reality. The monarchy functions through carefully defined roles, yet public affection rarely follows constitutional structures. People respond emotionally to personalities, values, and stories. Sometimes those responses align perfectly with institutional priorities. Sometimes they create unexpected dynamics. Several royal commentators have suggested that the current situation reflects exactly this tension. The announcement formally acknowledged Catherine's significance. Yet public reaction seemed to suggest that many people had already reached their own conclusions long before the statement appeared. That realization may explain why discussions quickly expanded beyond the announcement itself. Observers began examining broader questions about trust, influence, and the future image of the monarchy. They asked whether the institution's long-term success would depend less on ceremonial grandeur and more on maintaining genuine public connection. They questioned whether future generations of royals might be expected to engage with society in ways that would have seemed unusual only a few decades ago. And perhaps most importantly, they began asking whether the monarchy was already evolving faster than many realized. What makes this especially significant is that such changes rarely occur through a single dramatic decision. Instead, they emerge gradually through countless small developments that only reveal their significance when viewed together. The announcement, the public response, the growing focus on Catherine and William, the increasing attention directed toward future leadership. Individually, each development tells only part of the story. Together, however, they begin to form a much larger picture. Yet one major piece of that picture remained missing. Because while analysts were increasingly focused on public reaction, institutional planning, and future leadership, very little attention had been directed toward another crucial question. What effect was all of this having inside the royal family itself? Public perception and institutional strategy are important, but royal history repeatedly demonstrates that family dynamics can shape events in ways outsiders rarely anticipate. Decisions that appear straightforward from the outside often become far more complicated when viewed through the lens of relationships, expectations, and competing responsibilities. And according to some royal watchers, there were signs that those dynamics might be playing a far greater role than anyone initially suspected. If that proves true, then everything discussed so far, from the announcement itself to the public response that followed, may ultimately be remembered as only the visible part of a much deeper story, one whose most important implications have not yet fully emerged. What made the situation increasingly difficult to ignore was that the various threads of the story were no longer moving in separate directions. The announcement, the public reaction, the growing attention surrounding Catherine, and the broader questions about the future of the monarchy were beginning to converge into something larger. At the center of that convergence was expectation. Not the expectations placed on a single royal figure, but the expectations increasingly being placed on the institution itself. For years, the monarchy has relied on a delicate balance between continuity and adaptation. The challenge has never been choosing one over the other. The challenge has been convincing the public that both can exist simultaneously. Yet following the announcement, royal commentators noted a growing perception that many people were no longer evaluating the royal family solely through the lens of tradition. They were evaluating it through the lens of effectiveness. That subtle shift carries significant consequences. When public attention focuses on effectiveness, every engagement, every initiative, and every leadership decision begins to attract greater scrutiny. People naturally start asking different questions. Not simply who represents the monarchy, but who appears most capable of guiding it through future challenges. And that is precisely why the reaction to Catherine's announcement became so important. Because it suggested that public opinion may already be moving ahead of official narratives. Several analysts observed that discussions surrounding the Princess of Wales increasingly reflected future-oriented thinking. Supporters were not merely praising her current work. They were projecting forward, imagining how her influence might shape the monarchy years from now. In effect, a present-day announcement was generating conversations about a future that had not yet arrived. That development created new pressure. Not necessarily pressure on Catherine herself, but pressure on the institution to manage expectations that continue to grow. Royal households can plan transitions carefully, but they cannot completely control how the public imagines them. Once expectations begin forming independently, they become a force in their own right. And those expectations were no longer limited to Britain. International coverage revealed something equally noteworthy. Media organizations across multiple countries interpreted the announcement through remarkably similar themes. Stability, modernization, public trust, future leadership. Different outlets emphasized different aspects, yet the underlying narrative remained consistent. The announcement had become a symbol. Whether intended or not, it was increasingly being viewed as evidence of broader changes taking place within the monarchy. That interpretation matters because symbols often become more influential than the events that create them. A royal announcement lasts a day. A symbolic narrative can shape public perception for years. This may explain why some observers believe the palace now faces a more complex challenge than before. The institution must simultaneously preserve the authority of the present while preparing for the realities of the future. Neither objective can be neglected without consequences. And yet another factor was beginning to emerge. The more attention focused on future leadership, the more difficult it became to separate personal popularity from institutional responsibility. Public affection can be beneficial, but it can also create unrealistic expectations. History has shown that royal figures often become symbols of hopes that extend far beyond anything one individual can realistically achieve. Royal commentators have pointed out that this dynamic creates a delicate balancing act. If expectations continue rising, every future decision may be interpreted through an increasingly ambitious lens. Supporters may see evidence of transformation. Critics may see evidence of inconsistency. Both reactions can intensify scrutiny. That scrutiny was already becoming visible. The announcement triggered renewed analysis of how the royal family communicates with the public, how responsibilities are distributed, and how influence operates within the institution. Questions that might once have remained confined to royal experts were suddenly entering mainstream discussion. Why are certain figures attracting more public attention than others? How should leadership be presented during periods of transition? What role does public trust play in shaping the future of a constitutional monarchy? These questions did not emerge because of a single statement. They emerged because the statement acted as a catalyst for conversations that had been building quietly for years. That realization led to another important consequence. As public discussions became more sophisticated, observers increasingly focused on strategy rather than ceremony. The conversation shifted away from isolated events and toward long-term positioning. Analysts began examining how different royal initiatives fit together, how public engagement efforts were evolving, and what these patterns might suggest about future priorities. In other words, people were no longer just watching the monarchy. They were trying to understand where it was going. And once that process begins, every decision acquires greater significance. Even seemingly modest developments can be interpreted as indicators of larger trends. Every announcement becomes part of a broader narrative. Every public appearance becomes part of a longer story. That is exactly what appeared to be happening here. The announcement concerning Catherine was no longer being judged solely on its own merits. It was being assessed as part of an emerging pattern that many people believed pointed toward a new phase in royal leadership. Whether that perception is accurate remains uncertain. What is clear, however, is that perceptions themselves can influence events. Institutions respond to public confidence. Public confidence shapes expectations. Expectations influence future decisions. The cycle continually reinforces itself, and according to some royal watchers, that cycle may now be accelerating. Reports suggest that discussions surrounding the future role of the Prince and Princess of Wales are becoming increasingly difficult to separate from broader conversations about the monarchy's long-term direction. Not because anyone has formally announced such a shift, but because public attention keeps returning to the same fundamental themes. Trust, continuity, preparation, future leadership. The consequence is that every new development carries more weight than the one before it. Which brings the story to perhaps its most consequential point yet. Until now, the announcement could still be interpreted as a significant but isolated moment. By this stage, that explanation was becoming harder to sustain. Too many reactions, too many patterns, and too many emerging questions were pointing toward something larger taking shape beneath the surface. Yet one critical uncertainty remained unresolved. If all these developments truly are connected, if the announcement was part of a broader evolution already underway, then the most important question has not been answered at all. Because the real issue may no longer be what the royal family announced about Catherine. The real issue may be what the announcement unintentionally revealed about decisions, preparations, and priorities that have not yet been publicly explained. And if those hidden considerations come fully into view, the entire story could be understood in a completely different way. And that may ultimately be the most important revelation of all. After following every thread of the story, examining every reaction, and considering every implication, the announcement begins to look very different from the way it appeared at the beginning. At first, it seemed to be about Catherine. Then it appeared to be about public perception. Later, it became a story about leadership, succession, and the future direction of the monarchy. But by this stage, many royal observers would argue that the announcement revealed something even more significant. It revealed how the institution is being measured in a new era. For generations, the monarchy derived much of its strength from continuity. The ability to remain stable while governments changed, societies evolved, and political priorities shifted became one of its defining characteristics. Yet continuity alone is no longer enough. Modern institutions are increasingly expected to demonstrate relevance as well as stability. That expectation changes everything. Because relevance cannot simply be inherited, it must be continually earned. And according to many analysts, that is precisely why the announcement attracted so much attention. It highlighted a figure who, rightly or wrongly, has become associated with the monarchy's ability to connect with contemporary audiences without abandoning its traditions. The significance of that development extends well beyond one royal household. It touches on a much larger question facing constitutional monarchies throughout the modern world. How can centuries-old institutions preserve their identity while adapting to changing public expectations? How can they remain symbols of continuity without appearing disconnected from contemporary life? These are not temporary questions. They are long-term challenges that will shape the monarchy for decades to come. Viewed through that lens, the announcement begins to take on a different meaning. Rather than representing a single moment, it becomes part of an ongoing process, a process in which public trust, visibility, and authenticity increasingly influence how leadership is perceived. Several royal commentators have noted that trust has quietly become one of the monarchy's most valuable assets. Unlike ceremonial authority, trust cannot be granted by tradition alone. It develops gradually through consistency, credibility, and public confidence. Once established, it can strengthen institutions during periods of uncertainty. If weakened, however, rebuilding it can take years. That reality helps explain why the reaction to Catherine's announcement mattered so much. The response was not merely positive. It reflected a deeper sense of confidence among many members of the public. Confidence that certain figures within the royal family are capable of helping the institution navigate an increasingly complex future. Yet confidence also creates responsibility. As expectations grow, so does scrutiny. Every future initiative, every public engagement, and every leadership decision will inevitably be viewed through the framework established by moments like this one. The more symbolic importance people attach to individuals, the more carefully those individuals must balance expectation with reality. That challenge may become one of the defining themes of the years ahead, because the future facing the monarchy is unlikely to be defined by dramatic constitutional crises or sudden transformations. More likely, it will be shaped by a series of gradual adjustments, small shifts in communication, evolving public priorities, changing expectations regarding service and visibility. Individually, such developments may appear modest. Collectively, however, they can reshape how institutions are understood. And that may be exactly what royal observers believe they are witnessing now. Not a revolution, not a break with tradition, but a gradual evolution. An evolution in which influence increasingly flows through trust rather than distance, connection rather than formality, and engagement rather than symbolism alone. This perspective also helps explain why the story resonated so strongly with audiences beyond Britain. While the monarchy remains a uniquely British institution, the questions raised by this announcement are universal. How should leaders earn public confidence? How should institutions adapt without losing their identity? How can legacy and modernization coexist? Those questions extend far beyond palace walls. They speak to broader concerns about leadership itself. And perhaps that is why so many people continued discussing the announcement long after the official statement had been released. The conversation was never really about a press release. It was about what the reaction revealed. It revealed changing expectations. It revealed evolving definitions of leadership. And it revealed a public increasingly interested in the future rather than the past. For Prince William, the Prince of Wales, and Catherine, Princess of Wales, that reality presents both opportunity and responsibility. Public goodwill can provide momentum, but it also creates expectations that must eventually be met. The future king and future queen consort will inherit not only titles and duties, but also hopes, assumptions, and aspirations that continue to grow with every passing year. For King Charles III, the implications are equally significant. His reign occupies a unique position in royal history, serving as both a continuation of one era and a bridge toward another. Every major development inevitably becomes part of that larger narrative. And for the monarchy itself, the lesson may be even broader. Institutions endure not simply because they survive change, but because they find ways to adapt to it while remaining recognizably themselves. That may be the deeper meaning hidden within this entire story. The announcement was important. The reaction was revealing. But the larger significance lies in what both may indicate about the direction in which the monarchy is moving. Whether historians ultimately view this moment as a turning point remains uncertain. Major transformations are rarely obvious while they are happening. Their significance often becomes clear only years later, when individual events can be viewed as part of a larger pattern. The immediate situation may now be easier to understand. What remains far less certain is how future generations will interpret this period of royal evolution. Will they see it as a routine announcement that briefly captured public attention? Or will they look back and recognize it as one of those subtle moments when the future direction of the monarchy became visible before the institution itself fully acknowledged it? Because after everything that has unfolded, one question still lingers above all others. Was this simply an announcement about Catherine, or was it an early glimpse of how the royal family is preparing for the next chapter of its history? If you enjoyed this deep dive into the royal family, Prince William, Catherine, Princess of Wales, King Charles III, Princess, and the future of the monarchy, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our next royal analysis. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We'll see you in the next video.